Welcome everyone to Jerusalem and to the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. It's a great pleasure to meet you here. I'm Itzik, I'm the director of the Institute, and like you, I'm a medievalist, although there is a millennium between what you're doing and what I'm doing. More than a millennium, I should say. The Institute was founded in 1975 as a safe haven for scholars based on the model of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. And since its foundation, we have hosted more than 200 research groups and more than 2,000 individual fellows who spent a year doing pure research, which is our pride. We are the fourth Institute for Advanced Studies in the world, after Princeton, Stanford, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, and then us. And nowadays there are more than 400 similar institutes. Well, not similar because we are the best. But,
Not biased at all.
And well, actually we belong to the Ivy League of Institutes for Advanced Studies with Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, Wissenschaftskolleg, and a few more. It's a great pleasure to host you here. Each year we have 6 advanced schools for PhD students in various fields, in mathematics, physics, life sciences, economics, computer sciences and engineering, and humanities. And so you are part of our humanities advanced school for PhD students, and it gives me great pleasure to host a school on the Middle Ages or the Crusades. The general director of this advanced school is Tony Grafton, who apologizes that he couldn't be here, and he sends his greetings. And the organizers are, the actual organizers are Iris, Yoni, and Anna. And if I'll make a Crusader comparison, let's say Tony Grafton is Urban II, Iris, Yoni, and Anna are Tancred, and you're going to hear a lecture today by Baldwin. And so he's absolutely the master of Crusader studies in Israel, and he was also the head of the institute at the beginning of the 2000s. Without much ado, well, one more thing is that with all due respect to Princeton, you know that the first Institute for Advanced Studies was actually founded by Charlemagne in his itinerary court. And at about the same time, Harun al-Rashid founded a similar Institute for Advanced Studies, and I'm sure there was a connection between the two institutes, but I can't really prove it. So without much ado, I'll pass the baton to Iris to say a few words.
So thanks, Itzik. I'm very glad to see you all here. This is a very exciting moment for us. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the genesis of this event, of this school. It started back in 2019 when Ronnie Ellenblum, the late Ronnie Ellenblum, and I drafted the proposal for the Advanced School on the Crusades and met with Professor Anthony Grafton, where he approved this plan, and Professor Yitzhak Chen, who's the director, the academic director of this institute. They both were very enthusiastic about it. So this was back in 2019 when we started hearing rumors about this mysterious virus from China, which delayed our plans and changed our lives. So we had to wait, we had to delay it, and then a very tragic event happened with the sudden death of our dear friend and colleague, Ronnie Ellenblum, who was really my partner in initiating this. So we were planning for December 2021, and Ronnie left us in January 2021. and this really stalled everything. So it was thanks to the good cheer of my dear friend Itzik Chen, and the energies of Anna and Yoni, that we put everything back in action and started replanning the whole event. And you are here now. Right from the start, the original proposal, we had the support of our excellent colleagues from the UK, who were the academic committee of this school. Professor Jonathan Phillips, who will come soon, I hope, and he's the president of the SSCLE from Royal Holloway in University of London, and Professor Andrew Yotishki, also from Royal Holloway, University of London, and Professor William Perkis from University of Birmingham. So these were the original kernel. And then we were supported by Ann Zemo, Professor Ann Zemo from New Hampshire, and Dr. Sini Kangas from University of Tampere in Finland. So this is the group around which we've organized this very rich program, which initially we had planned to have a very broad range of the Crusades and the Latin East for you students to kind of think and do things and get acquainted with things that are outside your specific topic of research. So, and we've also designed it in a way that we can also showcase the rich archaeological remains and the sites in Israel, which you can see on the program, and also meet Israeli scholars and fine Israeli scholars that you will meet during the days ahead. So our plan was big, and I think it's reflected in the program that you see in front of you. And we also look very much forward to your contribution in the poster sessions and in the discussions and anywhere else. So feel free to get in touch with us in the personal meetings in any other way, because this is really for you, and I'm very, very glad to see all of you here. I wish to thank first and foremost Yitzhak Chen, who's the academic director of the Institute, and also the professional team that has been extremely helpful. Anat Yagil, whom you've met, and Iris Avivi, who is the administrative director of the Institute. They have been really great support for all this. So thank you, everybody, and I'm looking forward to spending time with you over the next week, I guess, yeah, almost a whole week. And now to Professor Kedar, who's going to present the keynote lecture for this evening. Professor Kedar, Emeritus Professor of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has been dealing with a wide variety of subjects, from the history of the Crusades to the use of aerial photographs as historical sources, from local to comparative to world history, from the discovery of medieval manuscripts, which he has discovered many, and medieval sources, to the exposure of the Nazi past of a leading German medievalist. He served as president of the SSCLE, founded its journal, Crusade, served inter alia as vice president of the Israeli Academy of Sciences, chair of the board of the Israel Antiquities Authority, and director of this institute, the Israel Institute of Advanced Studies. He also initiated a series of the Monumenta Germania Historica that offers critical editions of Hebrew works written in medieval German lands. He is also corresponding fellow of the Medieval Academy of America, as well as the MGH, and the recipient of two very prestigious Israeli prizes, the Emet Prize and also the Israel Prize in History. We are keen to hear the tips for Crusade studies, and having known Professor Kedar for many years, I can only say that you can expect the unexpected. Professor Kedar, please.
Thank you very much, Iris, for this generous introduction. And I would like to thank you for having invited me to give this introductory talk. Its preparation distracted me a bit from the ominous events that beset our country these days. In 1982, Hans Eberhard Meyer published an article in which he convincingly argued that the first 3 canons or chapters of the Council of Nablus in 1120 attest to a concordat between King Baldwin II and Patriarch Warmund, a concordat that amounted to a resounding victory of the Church regarding ecclesiastical tithe. And in the second canon, writes Meyer, the king, I quote, confessed that he and his barons had been guilty of superbia, pride, arrogance, if you wish, when they withheld the tithes and asked to be forgiven. Meyer quoted the decisions of the Nablus Assembly that appear in volume 21 of Mansi's Concilia, printed in 1776, 7 years after Mansi's death. And indeed, when we turn to the second canon in Mansi's edition, we read, Ego rex Balduinus, viris huius sacri concilii videntibus faventibus personis et baronibus meis, idemque prout parrochiarum suarum ratio exegit de suis decimis facientibus ut predixi decimas redo, et superbie qua ego vel ipsi interim retinuimus culpam faciens cum ipsis veniam peto. And the Latin of this sentence is somewhat awkward. At the head of Mansi's edition of the 25 canons of Nablus, we read that it reproduces the text appearing in the Latin manuscript number 1345 of the Vatican Library. This manuscript, which belonged to the Church of Sidon, south of Beirut, north of Tyre, is the only one to contain the canons of Nablus, the earliest laws of the Frankish Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, a few months after I read Meyer's article on the Concordat of Nablus, I spent some time in the Vatican Library, and for a reason I do not recollect, I ordered from the stacks inter alia manuscript 1345. I remember that I was immediately struck by the absence of the word superbia from the second canon, which you see here, where Mansi has et superbie, the manuscript, et superbie qua, the manuscript has indisputably, as you see here, et super his que. The sentence as appearing in the manuscript makes eminent sense. The king and the barons ask forgiveness for the tithes they held back. Asking for forgiveness, yes, but no confession for having acted out of superbia. The more I examined the text in the Vatican manuscript, the more I was struck by the very many deviations of the printed edition from the manuscript, the only manuscript, I repeat, that preserves this text. The version in Mansi, on which generations of Crusade historians have relied, turned out to be extremely faulty. For instance, the 5th canon of Nablus, that deals with adultery, reads in Mansi as follows. Quicumque cum alterius uxore concubuisse probatus fuerit, accepta judici sententia evitetur, et ab hac terra eitiatur, uecha vero enecetur, nisi vir eius misericordiam facere voluerit. Quod si fecerit ambo mare transgrediantur. Now, this means that the male culprit evitetur is punished by being shunned or avoided, whereas the female culprit enecetur is to be killed. This is a stunning disparity. But when we turn to the manuscript reproduced here, we read that the man is to be castrated, eviretur, not evitetur, and the woman is to have her nose cut, enazetur, not enecetur. Nose cutting was a punishment well known in Byzantium, and therefore I decided to compare the canons of Nablus with Byzantine legislation. It turned out that no less than 9 out of the 25 canons of Nablus closely resemble laws appearing in Byzantine codes of the 8th to 10th century. I dealt with this resemblance in detail in the introduction to my edition of the canons of Nablus that appeared in Speculum in 1999. And of course, the impact of Byzantine legislation on the early Frankish one is of considerable importance for the cultural history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But today I'm to present tips for research in Crusade studies, and the first tip is whenever you encounter a text edited in the 18th or earlier century, it is worthwhile to check that edition against the manuscript or manuscripts. The same is true of early visual documents. The earliest post-medieval document relevant for the location of Frankish Acre's eastern wall appears in a collection of plans and drawings prepared between 1685 and 7 during a reconnaissance mission sent out by King Louis XIV of France. In 1888, Emmanuel Guillaume Rey published this late 17th century drawing of Acre, and it was later reproduced in full or in part at least 5 times. Here you see its partial reproduction in Mahouli and John's Guide to Acre of 1946. The drawing, as published by Rey in 1888, supports the view that Frankish Acre was about of the same size as Acre's present-day Ottoman walled city. But on one of my visits to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, I used a break in the manuscripts department to drop in on the Département des Cartes et Plans, and just out of curiosity, asked to see the original of the Acre drawing. To my considerable surprise, I was shown a very long strip of which Rey chose to reproduce just about 1/3. Here is the full panorama, which required 3 different shots. Western part, central part, and eastern part, which shows that the remains of Acre extended almost to this stele, which the Franks called Toron, and which is called now Napoleon's Hill, because of the siege of 1799. This was the starting point, this drawing was the starting point of a study that ultimately led me to the conclusion that Frankish Acre was more than twice larger than the present-day old city. So again, when you face an early drawing, go back to the manuscript. So much for pre-modern texts, verbal and visual. But what about texts published later, in the age of critical editions? My tip, number 2, if you wish, is that when you come upon a difficulty posed by a passage in a critical edition, it may pay off to go back to the manuscript, or manuscripts, as the case may be, on which that edition is based. I recommend doing so because the difficulty you grapple with may appear only in the edited text and not in the manuscript. Let me give an example. In Roger of Hoden's draft or first redaction of his Chronica, there appears a list of the localities Saladin took after his victory at Hattin on the 4th of July, 1187, and before his conquest of Ascalon on the 4th of September of that year. The list, which stands out for explicitly designating each locality as a civitas or a castellum, or as a civitas with a castellum in its midst like Acre and Tiberias, this list is of great importance, although it escaped the notice of earlier students of the subject. But there is a puzzling spot in the list as edited in 1867 by William Stubbs for the Rolls series. In addition to the Civitates and Castella, there appear in the list 6 localities designated as castrum. Welcome, Mr. President. Well, as you see, you have many castella up there and down here, and you have 6 in Bishop Stubbs' edition, locations defined as castrum. So do we have Civitates, Castella, and Castra? The list itself opens by declaring that it is going to present Castella and Civitates, and at the end it repeats this assertion. So what is a castrum? I tried to see a difference in size and importance between these 6 castra and the many other castella and couldn't find one. So the puzzle found an easy solution once I switched from the text as printed in Bishop Stubbs' edition to the list as appearing in the manuscript the bishop used, now British Library Cotton Vitellius E17. It transpires that Stubbs, who did not draw his readers' attention to the poor shape of the manuscript and offered some reconstructions without presenting them as such, also overlooked what exactly is here where he read castrum. Let me enlarge this. Well, what we see is that there is a dot under the letter R of the word castrum and the letter L that appears above the R, which means that the scribe or somebody else realized that the word castrum was erroneously copied and attempted to correct it to castellum. An examination of the manuscript shows that the list's compiler indeed distinguished just between Civitates and Castella and did not mention Castra. I dealt with this issue in more detail in an article published in Burgen und Schlösser several years ago. Now, recourse to a manuscript may correct a reading even in what I consider the best critical edition in our field, the edition of William of Tyre's Chronicle, which Robert Huygens published in 1986. Let us have a look at Book 22, Chapter 17, where William describes Saladin's preparation to invade Galilee in 1182. in Huygens' edition, Saladin advanced to a place quidicitur lingua eorum ras el ine, quod interpretatur caput aquae. Saladin advanced to a place called in their language ras el ine, which means the head of water. Presenting the term as ras el ine, Huygens followed in the footsteps of Jacques Bongard in his edition of the Chronicle in Gesta Dei per Francos, which was published in Hanau, 1611. And please note, and this is tip number 7A, I don't know, not Hanover, as too many people write. Hanau is a place near Frankfurt on the Main, which was famous for its printing in those times. So please, Hanau, otherwise the editors of Crusades and other people will have to correct you. Okay, so here you see that Bongas also has ras el ine. Huygens just divided it into 3 elements. And when we go to the Recueil edition in 1844 by Beugnot and Leprévost, we have again quidicitur lingua eorum ras el ine quod interpretatur caput aquae. But what is ras el ine? Huygens, rightly puzzled by the term, proposed that el ine stands for el ein, that is the fountain. See his index page 1151, and let me tell you that he compiled this index in this building when he was member of the first research group on the Crusades that convened here in 83, 84. It was led by Joshua Praver and myself, and the members were Otto Smail from Cambridge, the teacher of Jonathan Riley Smith, Hans Meyer from Kiel, Robert Huygens from Leiden, and John Pryor from Sydney, Australia. So in his index he says el ine really means el ein, but this makes sense for an English speaker who sees the letters I and E and reads them ein. It doesn't make sense at all for somebody who writes in Latin. Also in his introduction, page 2, note 9, Huygens went so far as to suggest that William of Tyre was wrong to translate ras el ine as caput aquae, and he should have translated it caput fontis. But since William says that ras el ine means head of water, even a reader whose knowledge of Arabic is just rudimentary readily understands that ras means head, and that what appears in print as ine must stand for water. And he may go on to suspect, or to hypothesize, if you wish, that ine should be read as me, which everybody who has some experience with Latin paleography knows that it is very much possible to mistake an M for a combination of I plus N. And this hypothesis, and of course, me means water in vernacular Arabic. This hypothesis is fully corroborated when we employ the internet to read the passage in the digitized Latin manuscript number 2002 of the Vatican Library, the manuscript which, as Huygens established, was copied around the year 1200, which is, as he says, the most complete representative of a branch of the manuscript tradition that goes directly back to the archetype, and which has served, therefore, as he says, as the cornerstone of his edition. It is also the manuscript which contains the autobiographical chapter of William's Chronicle, which doesn't appear in any other manuscript. Now, this manuscript has indisputably Ras el-Me. Ras el-Me. So, William was right to translate it as head of water, no need to translate it head of fountain. Likewise, the anonymous libellus on Saladin's conquest of the Holy Land gives the name of the location as yes, as Ras el-Me. Ras el-Me in a different different letters, but it's the same idea. In Arabic chronicles, for instance, in that by Baha'u'ddin ibn Shaddad, the location appears is Ras al-Ma, and Ras el-Me is the vernacular version. And may I point out in passing that back in 1898, Stanley Lane Poole observed that by calling Cairo Masr, William provides the earliest testimony to the vernacular Arabic pronunciation of the city's name. Now, it may be worthwhile to study systematically William's transliterations of Arabic names and words and assess their contribution to the understanding of 12th century spoken Arabic. So if somebody is looking here for the subject, that is one suggestion. The tip I deduce from this example, a tip that pertains, however, to a very large number of issues, is that the student of the Frankish East should acquire at least a rudimentary knowledge of the Arabic language. By the way, in case you wish to know where Ras el-Me is located, you'll find the answer in one of the maps of Joshua Praver's Histoire du Royaume Latin de Jerusalem, a book that still offers the best account of the kingdom's general military history. Here it is, Ras el-Me, on the road from Damascus to Mecca, northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Before leaving texts and manuscripts, here is a fourth tip. Tip number 4. Always read carefully the introduction to a critically edited text. My impression is that historians all too often do not do so. I know that Robert Huygens, the complete editor, had the same impression. Such inattention to introductions is regrettable because they explain the rationale behind the editor's decisions, allow us to prefer a variant reading he or she discarded, and to share her or his knowledge of the author's sources, erudition, preferences, and much more. Let me add that introductions by Huygens contain also, time and again, exquisite exercises in sarcasm. My fifth tip is never rely on summaries of documents. Use summaries as pointers to documents, but rely on the documents themselves, not on the summaries. My work as editor of Crusades has taught me that young scholars often treat Röhricht's Regesta Regni Jerusalemitani, probably because Röhricht published his summaries in Latin, as if they were medieval texts, with sometimes truly alarming results. But not only young scholars. Look what happened to Stephen Runciman, author of the most famous history of the Crusades published in the 20th century. Speaking of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Runciman wrote, intermarriage with Muslims was allowed. In 1114, the Patriarch Arnulf was severely scolded by Pope Paschal II for having performed a marriage ceremony between a Christian and a Muslim lady. This eyebrow-raising assertion that the Frankish Patriarch of Jerusalem presided over an interconfessional marriage has not been, as far as I remember, previously commented upon. How did Runciman arrive at this assertion? In a footnote to the above statement, he refers to Röhricht, Regesta, number 83, page 19, where we learn, however, that far from scolding Patriarch Arnulf, the Pope allowed him to clear himself on oath of the charges raised against him and reinstated him as Patriarch. And what were the charges brought against him? Röhricht summarized them in his admittedly dense 19th century Latin. This is Röhricht's Latin, and from here Runciman deduced the assertion we just had. But the summary claims by no means that Patriarch Arnulf performed a marriage between a Christian and a Muslim. So let's go back to the original text, Pope Pascal's bull of the 19th July 1117. Here we read in lucid Latin that the charges against Arnulf were A, that he, Arnulf, was the offspring of an irregular marriage, and B, what you can read here, manifestum autem vobis omnibus esse volumus, quod mulieres ille de quibus idem patriarcha infamabatur, altera dicebatur uxor Girardi, altera Saracena, de qua filium genuerit. The charge was that he had relations with two women, one the wife of Gerard, the other a Saracen who gave him a son. Now, evidently Runciman, completely misunderstanding Röhricht's summary, transubstantiated Arnulf's alleged sexual relations with two women, one Christian, the other a Muslim, into Arnulf presiding over a marriage between a Christian man and a Muslim woman. Hence my fifth tip, beware of relying on summaries. But why did Runciman commit this astounding blunder? The answer is simple. Because he believed that intermarriage with Muslims would have enhanced the survival chances of the Frankish kingdom. How do I know this? Because having made the above statement, Runciman went on to say that by scolding Patriarch Arnulf, the Pope showed once again his misunderstanding of the East. For if the Franks were to survive there, they must not remain an alien minority, but must become part of the local world. It is evident, therefore, that Runciman misunderstood Röhricht's summary so ludicrously, because the misunderstood story tallied with his basic outlook. Or, to put it more starkly, he read the summary through the lenses of his convictions, and his erroneous reading helped to reinforce them. Well, most of us have, consciously or subconsciously, some general attitude toward crusading, or even harbor some prejudice, like, say, a pro-Hospitaller bias. My sixth tip is therefore, when your reading of a source appears to support your general attitude or bias, make an extra effort to ensure that your reading is well grounded. By the way, in the biography which Minou Dinshaw published in 2016 under the title Outlandish Knight, the Byzantine Life of Stephen Runciman, Runciman's endorsements of Frankish integration into the local world goes unmentioned, but Dinshaw relates that Uri Avneri, the Israeli journalist and politician, met with Runciman, and I quote, and emerged from the encounter convinced that if Israel were to avoid the Crusader state's unhappy example, it must become an integral part of its region, not a fortified ghetto. I come now to my seventh tip. Use sarcasm sparingly, taking into account that not every reader shares your sense of irony. This tip is rooted in the following story. In my article on the canons of Nablus in 1120, I mentioned that Arnulf was accused of having had sexual relations with two women, one the wife of Gerard, the other a Saracen who gave him a son, and in a footnote I quoted the relevant part of the Latin sentence and referred to Rudolf Hiestan's edition of Pope Paschal II's letter. Then I added in the footnote with tongue-in-cheek, it is noteworthy that Stephen Runciman learned from this letter, which he knew through Röhrist's summary, that intermarriage with Muslims was allowed, and I went on to quote in full Runciman's statement that you have just heard. I assume that every reader will understand the thinly veiled sarcasm of the statement, it is noteworthy that Runciman learned from this letter, etc. How wrong was I? Recently, I read an article by my late colleague and friend, David Jacobi, published in 2012, in which he referred to my statement about the accusations against Arnulf and to my footnote in which I drew attention to Runciman's misunderstanding. Then Jacobi, whose vast erudition outstripped his sense of humor, amalgamated Pope Paschal's genuine sentence with Runciman's misunderstanding of it and wrote, there were also unions between Franks and Muslim women. No one less than Arnulf of Schock, a Latin patriarch of Jerusalem from 1112 to 18, was accused by Pope Paschal II of having had sexual relations with a Muslim woman who gave birth to a son, and of having performed a marriage ceremony between a Christian man and a Muslim woman. Quod erat demonstrandum, sarcasm has its dangers, and I stand self-rebuked for having so imprudently indulged in it. This sets the scene for my eighth tip. Young scholars, but not only they, exhibit nowadays the tendency to accept uncritically the conclusions which authoritative historians present in a book published by a prestigious university press or in a leading journal. Therefore, I would not be surprised at all to find Jacobi's amalgam quoted lock, stock, and barrel in some new publication. Moreover, quite numerous scholars, especially beginners, appear to believe that almost everything that exists in print is valuable, that recent works are necessarily superior to older ones, and that good professional work is recognizable by its reliance on an up-to-date bibliography that parades recent publications, with no attempt being made to distinguish the wheat from the chaff. Well, let me remind you that Claude Cahn, one of the most perceptive 20th century historians of the Crusades, wrote in 1983, 40 years ago, that the quality of the publications on the Crusades is too often inverse to their quantity. His verdict on present-day publications would have been probably still harsher. Indeed, too many works churned out at present in our field are basically repetitive, exemplifying what I would call a law of diminishing marginal innovation. What we need, and this is my tip here, what we need is to sharpen our critical approach to all secondary literature and to have recourse to primary sources wherever their testimony is important for our argument. And we should be more aware that secondary literature of previous centuries, not only the 19th, but also the 18th, sometimes even earlier, occasionally contains valuable information and insights. Moreover, the noxious impact of passion or prejudice becomes almost effortlessly perceptible once we turn our attention to writings of more distant generations. These may sensitize us to notice more readily such flaws in works of our contemporaries and hopefully in our own as well. Tip number 9. Avoid translations, both of primary texts and of secondary literature, at least in those cases where the passage in question is central to your argument. As a rule, translate the passage from the original language. In case you do not know it, say Syriac. Consult with an expert. Explain what in the passage is important for you, and then ask for an exact translation. If it coincides with an existing translation, do quote that one. But if it does not, and in my experience, in very many cases it does not, use your expert's translation and, of course, give him or her the credit for it. And let me especially warn against using Babcock and Crate's translation of William of Tyre's Chronicle. As Anne Zemo, who is here with us, pointed out a few years ago, this translation, which she characterized as a staple of the classroom that in many ways sets the tone for how we continue to characterize the 12th century Crusader experience, is a translation that misleads the reader with regard to the way William names and describes the peoples he writes about. She also pointed out that Babcock and Cray repeatedly add a religious component that does not exist in the Latin text. May I add two other reasons for avoiding this translation? First, it translates the Recueil edition of William's Chronicle, published in 1844, and the text of the Chronicle as critically edited by Huygens in 1986 differs on several crucial points from the Recueil edition. Just to give you two examples, or the role of Peter the Hermit in the initiation of the First Crusade, and the recompense of the Genoese after the conquest of Acre in 1104. Huygens, in his modesty, did not point out the passages in which he improved in a very essential way on the earlier edition. So this is one reason. You can't use a translation based on an old edition and quote in the text the new edition, as some people do. Second, Babcock and Cray avoid translating accurately some bold or radical, if you wish, statements. For instance, William characterizes Guy, the lord of Scandalion, Iskenderune, south of Tyre, as rei militaris experientissimo sed modice fidei et deum prorsus ignoranti, which means a man most experienced in warfare, but of little faith and utterly ignorant or having no knowledge of God. A blunt characterization, indeed. Now Babcock and Gray translate, a man wide experienced in war, but of doubtful loyalty, and one who feared not God. How did they arrive at this translation? It took me some while to discover that they chose to translate the less radical characterization appearing in the Old French adaptation of William of Tyre, where we read that qui, petite voix de loyauté, et pour de toi notre Seigneur. And this is just one example. So I strongly advise you against using this translation, but in general, do not rely on translations, not of original texts, not of secondary literature. As the Italian saying has it, traduttore traditore. A translator is a traitor. Everybody who tried to translate himself into a different language knows how difficult it is and how many times you choose a variant which did not appear in the original version just because the target language has other characteristics. And sometimes between the source language and the target language, something very important may be lost. So I know that everybody in our town uses the English translation of Karl Erdmann's book. If you know German, read the German original. And this is of course true of medieval texts that should not be read in translation. Tip number 10. Get some training in archaeology. Some unknown written sources relating to the history of the Crusades may still be discovered. They are being discovered. And I hope that one day William of Tyre's lost history of Eastern rulers will surface in some, thank you very much, gracias Ago, will surface in some library, possibly under a different title. But much of the new information concerning the Frankish East will undoubtedly come in the future from objects which archaeologists will excavate and from the application of methods such as ancient DNA to such objects. It is therefore imperative that scholars working on the Frankish East should become familiar with archaeology, and in any case become capable of reading an archaeological report critically. Taking part in an excavation may help, but the sine qua non is the ability to competently utilize archaeological data. In other words, the future historian of a subject like the Frankish East will have to know what is compelling and what is just probable in an archaeological report. And you need to acquire this capability. It is of utmost importance. And Now to tip number 11. In all there will be only 12, so we are close to the end. Tip number 11, engage in comparative history by employing the asymmetrical mode. Facets of the Frankish East should be compared with those of Norman and Staufen, Italy, Sicily, the kingdoms of Iberia, the countries of the West, Byzantium, and last but not least, the realms of Islam, and possibly still other regions. You may object that this is a tall, unrealistic order. You may say that the research literature on the Frankish East is growing at so rapid a pace that to take all of it into account becomes ever more difficult. To engage in comparisons with other regions is just impossible. And this is true. Yet there is a way out of this quandary. The asymmetrical comparison proposed by Jürgen Koka, the eminent social historian. Koka urges us to aim at a better understanding of the particular case that is our chief concern by contrasting it with other cases that are merely sketched, not systematically compared. And these sketches may derive from secondary literature. That is, if you compare some facet here in the Frankish East with facets in Iberia or in Sicily, you don't have to become an expert on Sicily, an expert on Iberia. You can look for comparative material in the secondary literature, and when there is a specific reason, go back to the original texts referring to be it Sicily, Iberia, Byzantium, and so forth. Koka is aware of the pitfalls of this good procedure, deriving sketches from secondary literature and consequently falling victim to sundry modes of distortion. Yet he believes that these dangers are more than offset by the advantages of the approach. It widens historians' horizons by providing them with a comparative perspective that may lead to otherwise unsuspected questions and answers. In short, Koka presents asymmetrical comparison as a high-powered, low-cost tool. In this talk, I discussed several discoveries. I would like to conclude by asking, is there a recipe for making discoveries? Is there a recipe for making discoveries? Yes, there is. And it was prescribed by no less a researcher than Louis Pasteur, who in an address delivered in Douai on the 7th of December 1854 observed that chance favors only the prepared minds. Le hasard ne favorise pas que les esprits préparés. What he says is that we should always be ready to expect some discovery lurking behind the corner. If we train ourselves to so expect, it is likely that we shall spot the discovery on sight, even as researchers with unprepared minds will inattentively trudge on. May I present Pasteur's recipe as the 12th tip and amplify it by proposing that we should not only prepare ourselves for a stroke of chance waiting behind the corner, but that we should also wander far and wide with no specific aim in mind, courting our luck by casting our net really wide. Let me conclude with a story that exemplifies what I have in mind. The sculpture of an embracing couple, now in the Musée Historique Lorrain in Nancy, has been repeatedly pressed into service to illustrate historians' works on pilgrimage or crusading, for instance, on the cover of Jonathan Riley Smith's trailblazing First Crusaders. But the historians who have made use of this sculpture described it just briefly and in very different ways. Or they just didn't study the specialized literature on this sculpture, and you may read very conflicting characterizations of the sculptures, sometimes within the same work by a historian. Indeed, many historians exhibit the tendency of devoting much less attention to visual texts, like the Nancy sculpture, than to written ones. One gains the impression that visual texts serve them mainly or merely for embellishment. But a visual text is no less important than a written one, and this is another thing we must learn. In any case, the art historian Nurit Kenan Kedar, my late wife, and I decided some 30 years ago to study the history of the Nancy sculpture, the proposed identifications of the embracing couple, and the pictorial traditions the sculpture exhibits. We started our study by a visit to the Nancy Museum, to which the sculpture was brought from the Priory of Belleval, apparently in 1819. In the museum, the sculpture, known as Le Retour du Croisé, the return of the Crusader, is situated in a rounded niche which allows only for a frontal view of the sculpture. We were not able to obtain photos taken from the side or from behind, and therefore we reluctantly decided to limit ourselves to an examination of the frontal view. But as we were leaving Nancy, one of us suggested to drive south for some 50 kilometers to Belleval, hoping to see there some remains of the medieval priory, even though the guidebooks do not mention such remains. It turned out in this case that the guidebooks were right. We found no medieval remains in Belleval, and the present-day chapel dates from the 19th century. But as we were entering the chapel, we were surprised to see in it a full-size plaster cast of the sculpture of the embracing couple. As it stands there, freestanding in the chapel, we could observe that the embrace is close and intimate. The woman's right hand lies on the man's neck, while the man's left hand rests on the woman's left shoulder. Thank you very much.
Would you like to stay here for maybe some questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Kedar. To your honor, I will mention that there are several direct students of yours here in the audience, and also grant students. Can I say that? it's been always very hard to emulate the wide range of methodologies, different historical periods, and even disciplines that you have tackled with in your many years of research. But also remember, always remember that you always have to go deep into the manuscript, deep into the text and the translation, as you have been very generous to show us today. So this is a great lesson that we've been trying to follow for many years, and there's many students here, Professor Adrian Boaz and Dr. Robert Cole, and Professor Jonathan Rubin, and as I mentioned, grant students, Dr. Anna Goodgatz and Dr. Netta Amir, and also I think Dr. Rafi Lewis. So this is really for your honor that we have been working on many different areas and many different disciplines, following your tips that you have given us over many years, which I take to be cautious and be suspicious and never trust Runciman, I guess. So we have a few minutes if anybody has a comment, because this is an academic conference, although it's a festive occasion, but also it's an academic conference. So if you have any thoughts or questions or wondering about something, please raise your hand. Take a moment to think about it, but don't be shy. I think this is also one of your lessons. Don't be shy. All right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi.
Ruben.
Yes.
Hi. Haven't seen you.
Yeah. So I'm not.
Professor Ruben Amitai from Hebrew University. Yeah.
So I'm not a student or a grad student, but friends of many students, and indirectly, of course, indirectly learned much from Professor K. Garner's writings, and certainly from the students. And of course, we never forget for a minute our friend and belated colleague Ronnie Elleblum, who a student and a friend of mine, of course, a student of yours and a friend of mine, from whom I learned so much, indirectly from you too. So I just want to mention that almost everything you said, and I came in just a little late, so I apologize, almost everything you said could be applied to Islamic and Middle Eastern studies too. So that just shows, and I think that, and I think you touched upon this, perhaps more than touched upon it, the importance of the two fields of Crusader studies in the wide sense and Islamic studies, the use of Arabic and other Islamic languages and Islamic history need to work together. Not everybody can learn all the languages, but we can certainly sit and talk and learn from each other, as I've done so much with my colleagues here, mostly in Israel, but also abroad. The other point, and I think a point that I've heard you say before, but I don't think you said it today, is the importance of cooperative work, particularly. I think you pioneered that with both people, your peers, and your students. And I had the honor of working with you, of course, in that article about Nasser al-Hussein many years ago. So I think that's also important, that the importance of working together, the importance of knowing our limits, but at the same time wanting to know more and wanting to get there. And knowing that by working together and cooperating, that we can go even further.
Yeah. So I'll just mention that I cooperate with Ruben Amitai on a research project. So I've learned my lesson.
Yes, I perfectly agree, of course, but what I would like to point out is that even before you start to cooperate, you should try to make an acquaintance with the other field. Let me give you an example. Years ago, I cooperated with a scholar, an expert on medieval Islamic history. And it was very helpful to see that he has some knowledge of Latin and I have some knowledge of Arabic. This helps. That is, we should be open to cooperation, but we should try to train ourselves to be worthy of this cooperation.
Anyone else? Any other comments, thoughts? very much. Let me thank you again.